gentlemen, and as always, a very warm welcome on behalf of the Warwick Economics Summit team. For our in-person attendees, do feel free to use the Slido platform. And a reminder, the code is 2192668. We have an exciting lineup of events today, and I'd like to begin by welcoming accomplished economist and author, Ms. Sharda Dean, to introduce the highly anticipated Prasad Lecture Series. Ms. Sharda Dean, please.
It's a real honor to be here today to introduce Ignazio Visco, Governor of the Bank of Italy. Dr. Visco's talk is the latest in the annual lecture series in honor of my father, Bishnadat Persaud. And I would like to thank Warwick University for their help in organizing this event and for asking me to make a few opening remarks today. Dr. Visco wrote in one of his recent papers, "Growth depends on the capacity to incorporate and foster innovation and on the quantity and quality of investment in education and knowledge." And I was struck that this was something that my father would have strongly agreed with. He was a great believer in human ingenuity and in the power of education to transform people's lives. He had a wide range of special interests, including international development, finance, the environment, Caribbean economics, and the economics of small states. As the novelist Hilary Mantel once said, "As soon as we die, we enter into fiction." Just ask two different family members to tell you about someone recently gone, and you will see what I mean. Once we can no longer speak for ourselves, we are interpreted. So all I can give you today is a short interpretation of my father. I once found my dad leafing through the dictionary and asked him what he was doing. He told me that he was going through page by page and learning all the words that he didn't yet know. Being a teenager at the time, I must have expressed some skepticism about this endeavor because he responded with slight irritation that he was doing a few pages every day and had already got to the letter P, thank you. This was very like Dad. He felt that his vocabulary could be improved. He came up with an ambitious yet workable plan, and he carried it through quietly until it was all done. In fact, if I hadn't walked in at that moment, I would probably have never known about it. My father was born in rural British Guyana and lost his own father when he was just 13. Dad had a long and distinguished career, but at the height of his powers, he was at the height of his powers whilst working as director of the Economic Affairs Division of the Commonwealth Secretariat. He created what the then Secretary General Sridath Ramphal called a centre of economic thinking that served the world, and very especially the developing world. Esteemed British diplomat Sir Peter Marshall said, "The Economic Affairs Division in particular was of the highest calibre, with Dr. Persaud, its director, giving it special lustre." He added, "The result was that the output of the division enjoyed an appreciative market well beyond its intended direct recipients." One example of this wider impact was on the issue of sanctions against the South African government and its regime of legally institutionalized segregation known as apartheid. There was much discussion of the need for the adoption of sanctions in the mid-1980s, but the UK government under Mrs. Thatcher was resistant. Despite this, my father and his team decided to do all the technical preparation on the options available, so that if the politicians ever agreed, everything would be ready. I remember him explaining to me the care required in coming up with a list of sanctions that would maximize the impact on the South African government while minimizing the fallout on the South African people. As a result of this work, the Commonwealth was the first big international organization to adopt sanctions against South Africa. Other countries followed, including the US. Soon after his release, Nelson Mandela and his first port of call was the Commonwealth Secretariat to acknowledge the importance of their role in freeing South Africa. Other significant contributions that the Economic Affairs Division made at this time were in helping to initiate and support international work on debt relief for highly indebted countries, and also in the area of sustainable development. As a result of his work on the environment, my father eventually returned to the Caribbean as founding director of the University of the West Indies Centre for Environment and Development, where he was a professor of sustainable development when the subject was still in its infancy. He was also a member of the UN Committee for Development Planning, a group of 24 economists advising the UN. And in 2013, he made Companion of Honour in the Barbados Honours List. But of course, his work was only part of who he was. My fondest memories of him are of watching TV sitcoms together, such as Porridge and The Good Life. And he loved cricket, as a boy, always ducking out to play, much to his mother's annoyance. And much later, taking great delight in the West Indies victories in the era of Viv Richards and Clive Lloyd, reveling in the idea of small islands beating the English quite literally at their own game. But in speaking about my father, I'm conscious that it is all too easy for a memory of someone to harden over time into a few often repeated achievements or anecdotes. So I wanted to mention one thing that not many people know about him. Some people swear by daily meditation, but my father had an almost religious belief in the power of a regular critical thinking habit. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." My father would have said, "I am, therefore I really must think." He took thinking very seriously. He would take a topic and ring-fence 30 minutes or so to really mull it over. He kept a log of all of these thinking sessions over the years, and by the end of his life, he'd stacked up over 15,000 sessions. Looking through his last logbook, I can see the wealth of different topics he covered. The limits of knowledge, suffering as a basis for morality, the nature of music, vowels and consonants, democracy, empathy, and relativity. There are plenty of economics topics too: capitalism and corruption, information imbalances, performance pay and risk-taking, Japanese stagnation, currency wars, and Ponzi schemes. In fact, one of his thinking topics in 2015 was inflation and asset prices. So I know he would have loved to have been here today to listen to this talk. Which brings me back to our speaker. Dr. Visco was appointed governor of the Bank of Italy in 2011 after a long career with the bank that began in 1972. He is a member of the Governing Council and General Council of the ECB, on the Board of Directors of the Bank for International Settlements, and on the Board of Governors of the IBRD and the Asian Development Bank. From 1997 to 2002, he was chief economist and head of the economics department of the OECD. Like my father, Dr. Visco has written widely on economics and finance, and I'm sure they would both have had plenty to talk about together. But I think what would have linked them most of all is a sense that people matter and a desire to use economics to make lives better. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning. Good morning to all. Many thanks, Charlotte, for your words. Many thanks for the invitation to the organizer of this Warwick Economics Summit, the coordinators, all those who participated in this event. And I hope that I will not take too long in thanks and go immediately to the subject matter of my talk, which has to do with monetary policy and the return on inflation. There is a written text that you can download from the Bank of Italy website. So I will only go through a few slides, charts, and try to combine with some words on them, also some views about what I think monetary policy is and should be doing. Now, obviously, inflation is back. We know that, we have seen it, we somehow feel it in our pockets. There is a loss in purchasing power, and there is somehow a rate of inflation that last year ranged at the global level around 9%, 7% in advanced economies, 10% in emerging and developing ones, and with peaks. Peaks also above 10% in the US, in the UK, in Europe. The interesting thing is that there are different sources of these inflation that somehow new coming back. The interesting thing is that this is not a new phenomenon, but somehow it was something that in the last 3-4 decades was forgotten. You have to go and you see from this chart to the 1970s and 80s to see this substantial spike in inflation, but it was not only a spike, it was, a matter of fact, 2 spikes because there were 2 oil shocks, one after the Yom Kippur War, or during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and the other during the revolution in Iran in late 1979. Now, these shocks may have been temporary. Instead, they were prolonged, and there was inflation that persisted for some time. So we know from those years that high inflation can be there, and once you have that, and it's permanent, it's pretty hard to rein it. But it was reined in a way. There were mistakes done. We learned from mistakes. There was excessive fiscal expansion. There was especially a wage price spiral coupled with depreciation of the currency in a number of countries, severe ones. So there is a shock in oil, prices increase, wages increase in order to compensate for the loss in purchasing power. This goes into labor costs. Labor costs imply an increase in producer prices. This means that there is a loss also in competitiveness. The exchange rate depreciates. It adds to the cost of imported inputs and goes back and forth. The main lesson that was not learned, but that was not known at the beginning, learned now, is that when you have this kind of shock, which is called supply shock by the economists, you cannot compensate for that. You cannot send it back to where it came from. You have to take it. And you have to compensate the loss in purchasing power through increases in incomes and wages and at the end profits for companies through higher investment and productivity gains. So with productivity gains, you can make up the losses in real incomes, but you cannot transfer them within an area which has imported this inflation. You cannot transfer them, you should not transfer it to future generations through the accumulation of public debt. This lesson was learned. It was understood that fiscal expansion had to be reined in. It was understood that central banks were to be given the independence necessary to use all the monetary policy tools to combat the inflation push. And it was understood also that at the end, it is very important for the social partners to work together and to avoid transferring from one to the other the shock. This was what was learned after in late 1980s. It was coupled with major changes in the world economy. It became a global world. So globalization, it became a world of technological change, incredible technological change. You were all born after that started, but it was incredibly different from the period in which I already was working since 15, 20 years in the Bank of Italy. And these changes were coupled with independence and monetary policy. These ended up producing the years of great moderation, so-called. Now, great moderation means also that the world economy improved very much. There was a reduction in absolute poverty at the world level, but there were some major difficulties on a number of components of the population, of especially of advanced economies, with inequality rising. But inflation was moderate. This is why it is called the Great Moderation. Afterwards, we had instead the Great Recession. And with the Great Recession, the legacy. There was, and I'm not going to talk about this, but perhaps in the questions we may answer something. There were two crises, financial crisis, one global, 2007, 2008, another within the euro area. It is called the crisis of the debt, public debt of euro area countries. And these sovereign debt crisis ended up pushing prices downwards. Also, the global financial crisis had this effect, and in fact, there were fall in real interest rates, which were helped by demographics going in a particular direction, but there was what Larry Summers called the secular stagnation, the risk that for a long period, because of that financial crisis, the economy would not be able to pick up. Real rates were low, also because real returns of investment were low, and the economy was not able to really go back at the high rates that we had observed in previous decades. At the same time, we had inflation going down below what the targets were considered by central banks. The target of price stability means that not that prices should not rise, but prices should rise at a moderate rate in the medium term. We define 2% for a number of reasons, because there must be some leeway in the way wages and profits adjust, and the movements in relative prices are taken into the picture, but at the same time, there is a substantial measurement problem, so 2% is fine in the medium term. But inflation was going below that. So the reaction of monetary policy was very clear, easing financial conditions, and in fact, interest rates were reduced dramatically. In the euro area, the interest rates controlled by the central bank, the official interest rates, they were brought to levels which were negative, below zero. So when I went to school, an interest rate had a zero lower bound, no question. Instead, we exceeded that, and now we started talking about the effective lower bound, which is something below zero, but not too much below, because you cannot do. But this means that if you put money, if you lend money to somebody, rather than being paid, you are paying for that person to receive this money. This is just a negative interest rate. So very odd, but we wanted to have the economy responding with very favorable financial conditions. At the same time, there was quantitative easing. That is, you start purchasing securities, public and private, and these purchases meant at the end that the whole range of interest rates was lower than it had naturally been, and this implied that financial conditions were good also for investment. It worked? Yes, it worked. It was very tough. It was a battle against deflation, but at the end it worked. And then it came the rest, that is the pandemic. And it came when we were more or less convinced that the job had been done. And so we were going to normalize monetary policy. But then we waited. We let the financial markets adjust through our easing to continue. And for some time, working together with the fiscal authorities, we were able to avoid two things: major supply disruptions at the world level, and substantial scars in households, in business, and so on, that would have kept demand, aggregate demand, at a very low level. So this was a success. But was it a success that created the risks for a demand recovering too much and inflation being generated of that? Well, this is the subject of the next slide. Well, there was a substantial fiscal support, especially strong after the shock in the pandemic, say February, March 2020. And there are different sources of inflation here, because you see here, it's very interesting, the fiscal policy, all countries had an easing of fiscal policy. That means increasing fiscal deficits and raising public debt. But it was especially strong in the United States. In the United States, it moved from 100 to 130% of GDP. Debt to GDP ratio increased dramatically. Somehow 25 percentage points. In the euro area, it increased still substantially, but 15 percentage points. The issue here is whether it was excessive or not. And the answer is clear. It was excessive in the United States. You see the comparison between GDP growth and the growth of household disposable income. Well, in 2020, GDP fell both in the US and in the euro area. In the US, it fell by something like 3.4%. In the euro area, much more, 6.4%, almost double. And in the euro area, with the help of fiscal measures, that is transfers to households and to the business who were more severely hit by the pandemic because of the lockdown, because of the being them in the service sector where distancing had a major effect and so on. In household disposable income in Europe still fell, but much less than GDP. Rather than -6, it fell by -0.6. What about the United States? The United States, the fall in GDP, that is in the total output produced in the country, was severe, but it was, as I said, less than in the euro area, 3.4%. What about disposable income? Disposable income in real terms increased and increased by 6.2%, one of the highest increase in household disposable income in the American history. But it was clearly leading to something, and what it led to, it was to an excess demand for goods. The service sector was not doing well, neither in the US nor in the euro area and in the United Kingdom, as a matter of fact. But the recovery in the demand of durables was incredible. That is the success of the policies, fiscal policies, which also helped financing the pharmaceutical industry that ended up providing the vaccines that gave both confidence and security. All these created, however, given all the transfers that were provided by the US administration, a substantial push in the demand. Demand increased dramatically. Supply did not adjust because supply had been constrained by the pandemic. Plus, the supply comes mostly from countries where the pandemics were still very heavy. So chips, semiconductors, all these things were basically not available. Plus, wages had to increase in order to convince people to go back to work in the US once they had received sufficient transfers to somehow take a time before choosing any job. In the United States, it is different than continental Europe. There is not much of a welfare state, and therefore, when you are fired, you immediately try to find another job. In this case, they could wait. All these pushed wages up, demand high, prices increased. Europe, well, Europe, not the same picture in terms of demand, but something different may have happened also, and not even in terms of labor market. Let's see what is, yes. This is the push in wages that you see in the US, which is much more than what we have observed in Europe. In Europe, there is still until end of last year, moderate rate of growth of wages, even if now there are requests of higher adjustments because to compensate the loss in purchasing power. Now the second major factor, and this is a different source of inflation, is the increase in energy prices. Now, this is a shock, a new shock. So we had the pandemic, and now we have are they linked? Well, difficult to say. There is some who say there is a lot of liquidity in the world, and therefore this created somehow the main basis for prices really to increase. Money and prices are somehow related. It's not that mechanical. Huh? It's much less than that. But there are some ideas. But this was not what happened. We have seen it in oil prices. There has been some increase. But more or less the same in Europe and in the States. It was basically somehow increasing from $60 a barrel to 80 in October 21, to 100 in early 22, then back to 80, now 22. So it has been a substantial increase, but not an increase of dramatic. What was dramatic is the increase in natural gas prices. In the US, it went from 10 to 30 to again to 22 and 10. They're 10 now, dollars per megawatt hour. In Europe, well, in Europe, we started from 10 euros per megawatt hour, January 2020. Then it went up to 180 early 22. It increased gradually in 21 and then started increasing very fast in 22. And in 21, and then in 22, beginning of 22, it was around 180. Then there was the Ukraine invasion, the part of Russia. And we have observed these rising to 150, 350 in the summer. Where is it now? Now it is 60. So it went up dramatically and then it went down dramatically too. What are the factors? Well, there is something like the rise in orders, the acceleration of orders, the replenishment of stocks, all linked to the fact that supply is constrained. And it was constrained also in 2021. Simply, we did not realize that. We thought during 2021 that there had been a very bad winter in Russia, this reduced supply of natural gas. There had been political quarrel between Russia and Germany on the opening of this new pipeline called Nord Stream 2. We did not realize that there was much more of a geopolitical nature behind that. And at the end, if you look at these figures, even 60 coming from 20 is a major increase. Divided 60 by 20, and you have in 100% changes still with respect to what it was in 21, in beginning of 21. So this is a skyrocketing of prices. It is an amazing push, a supply push. Similar to the 1970s that I was talking about before. And what happened? Well, inflation increased because inflation has a direct component, besides the demand effects I was talking about, it has a direct component in the consumer baskets of the energy consumed, electricity, gas. There is an indirect component through the cost of energy for the production of goods and services, which at the end are sold retail to consumers and they go back in the basket. So we had this. But in the US, what was dominant was a demand factor. If you exclude the energy and food prices are very volatile. So when we consider something called underlying inflation or core inflation, we exclude energy products and food. But here, food prices increase also because of the war. The Ukrainian war constrained the exports of grain, wheat from Ukraine. There was, and it was very important, this during the first months of the war. Then there was an agreement, it went down, then it up. But the two combined really explain a large part of the increase in Europe, much less in the United States. Well, natural gas in the United States is a different story. They produce it. And if there are some problems at the end that they cannot export, their price falls. So they basically export liquefied gas. If there is a problem in producing liquefied gas, they have to sell the gas which has been produced in the country. This keeps prices low. In our case, we were dependent on Russian gas. And this dependency has been somehow changing in the last year. It will continue to change, but it's still biting. The interesting thing is that these produce something. Well, the story goes this way. This energy problem shock was clear, but somehow some commentators were thinking, well, but central banks reacted too late. And they were part of the story of this inflation push. And indeed, they not only reacted late, but they were not even to understand that inflation was going up. In fact, they made major forecasting errors. These are the forecasting errors. Well, the 4 quarters ahead is a spectacular mistake done, say, January 2022 for January 2023. The 1 quarter ahead was a spectacular mistake also during the whole 2022. Now it is improving the forecasting capacity. So this is, according to some, a loss in credibility of central banks. Since credibility is important to convince the market at large, the business sector, and so on, that we are going to rein on inflation, this is something that will help maintaining inflation high. Well, the question is whether that was really so. Can be answered in various ways. The first way is that no, the errors were mostly 70%, 80% of the errors due to errors in the assumptions that are used in doing the projections exercises with models, econometric, various kind of econometric models. The issue is that the basic mistake was the assumptions on where the energy prices would have been during the year and the future years. The normal input for these projections is futures markets. Well, futures markets were not forecasting neither the Ukrainian invasion and war, nor really the bottlenecks that somehow were in making it difficult to transport both certainly liquefied gas, but also other components of intermediate goods. The story has to be cut here, but the problem of the quality of forecasts and how to make forecasts remains. It is not, I believe, for a time being, a change in behavior. We thought that behavior would have changed possibly very much due to the pandemic. Actually, from this exercise, you see that the major forecasting error was due to the hypotheses that were used in the exercise. Basically, we did not foresee. We made a mistake in not understanding that there were bottlenecks, not much relevant for the UK, for the European Union, relevant for perhaps UK, certainly relevant for the US. We did a major mistake, but it was a mistake shared with all forecasters, not only central banks, in understanding the maintenance, as a matter of fact, further increase of very high energy prices. Indeed, we said this is a temporary shock. If there is a supply shock, textbooks tell you, if you study this, monetary policy should wait. The supply shock is eliminated, and then you go back. You have a loss, but you are not going to have it propagated. Instead, we are seeing that there is some propagation. Monetary policy reacted very much. They reacted starting end of 2021. Those critics say it should have started earlier. Well, the problem is that until mid of 2021, inflation was below 2% in the euro area, and core inflation, the underlying one, below 1%. We had won the battle against deflation, but we have not been able really to bring back inflation to our target. So the issue here was very clear. We have to once we see the signals of prices really being maintained at a very high rate of inflation, and we see that inflation expectations may start reacting, we start with what we call first normalization of monetary policy and then tightening of monetary policy. Monetary policy was tightened. The interest rates, first of all, we stopped QE, the easing, we stopped buying bonds, and now we started recently to disinvest the stocks we have, not reinvesting what goes to maturity, but at the same time, we have this interest rate policy. We increased interest rates, official interest rates, by 300 basis points. They were negative as far as what we call the rate on the bank deposits. No, we finance the economy gets all this money, then the money goes into the deposits of banks, and then the deposits of banks are brought to the central bank at a rate. The rate was negative. That is, we were paying them rather than in order to stimulate the economy. It was minus 0.5. It is now 2.5. We last week decided that most likely it will be 3 by beginning in March. And then we'll see. We'll see what will happen in the new data that we have, the incoming data, and the inflation outlook. As a result of this, interest rates increased also in the market, and real interest rates went up. They went up in real terms, can be seen from here, from minus 4% and minus 2% 1 year and 10 years ahead to 0.9 and 0.3. They became positive again. It's all right. Well, before saying whether it's all right, let's see what was the success or insuccess of monetary policy. And this is a very difficult thing, very technical. It is, for those who know some econometrics, is a BVAR model, bias and vector autoregressive model that tries to decompose the various factors behind the changes in inflation expectations. To make the story short, inflation expectations still driven in Europe by supply factors, energy prices mostly. In the US, demand, even in 2022, not only 21, it continued. It is the brown thing. It is, sorry, the hard blue thing. The light blue is the supply side. And monetary policy, well, monetary policy has an effect, especially monetary policy in the United States has a major effect for the United States, but also for Europe. There is somehow spillover there. And monetary policy in Europe is starting to bite. We have colleagues when we take decisions on monetary policy, there is a governing council of the European Central Bank that is formed by 6 members that were there and the governors of the member states. And so we take decisions and we have a lot of dialogues, different views and so on. There are 2 points here. The first is the monetary policy, after all, is not having too much effect. Low effect, most is the end of the supply shock. So if things go fine, we may be successful also in not raising rates too much. But there are also others who say, well, there is a risk, however, and so we better err on the side of raising rates too much than too little. I'll say something at the end to make a few points on this. But what I wanted to say here is that even if monetary policy is apparently not having much success because it's not needed in this case, it is not also harming too much the real economy. And at the same time, the counterfactual, suppose you didn't do that. What would have been the impact on inflation expectations? Probably they would have kept going up. Instead, they were going down, and with them, also inflation is going down. Well, it's interesting because it is now there is something that many talk about is instantaneous inflation. The inflation is measured as today's level of general price level divided the same 12 months ago. So there is something called the basis effect. Well, you can have instantaneous. What is today's change with respect to the last minute annualized? We have a 3-month moving average. It shows goes down very much in the United States. It is going down also much more, perhaps also in Europe. And the interesting thing is this sign of effect, positive effect of monetary policy, or it is the supply side that is somehow halting, having an effect? I told you it was 350 per megawatt hour euros in August. It is 60 now. So, and in fact, the direct component of the general price index went down, and this is headline inflation. And it went from 10.6 in October to 8.5 in January for the euro area. The headline inflation down, and it is foreseen to continue if energy prices don't pick up again. What about the core inflation? Well, that is the other goods and services besides energy and food. Well, that did not went down. It's still at 5%, more or less. So the big issue is here. When energy increased, core inflation increased. Now that energy goes down, will core inflation go down? We don't know. It is possible. There are no basic reasons why it should not, but we have to be very vigilant, and monetary policy will keep taking account of that, especially for one reason. To make things short, Milton Friedman some time ago said that somehow inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Money increases, prices increase. Well, it's not. It's either a truism or a complicated causal relation. But because after all, inflation is the money is something on the money price of goods. Somebody used this similar sentence: the floods are a watery phenomenon. But, yes, but this is not because water is too much, you have the floods. So this is a complicated thing. But the question is, did we create too much liquidity? Well, perhaps a lot of liquidity. Balance sheets of central banks increased very much, but we are in the process of reducing them. The big question here is not that, is whether inflation will go down with real activity. With the unemployment or the upward gaps. Unemployment is pretty low. The economy is doing very fine. But the Phillips curve, what is called the Phillips curve that relates inflation or wage changes with unemployment, or the gap between actual demand and potential demand, is the slope of this is flattening. This means that it has a less impact. What is most important nowadays is consider inflation expectations. Wages react to inflation expectations. If things go fine, wage expectations are pretty well anchored. There is no major problem here. And this is something on this, the market-based. Is this. So we don't see, but the big question is another one. Is the 1970s experience going to repeat? That is, at the time, I did a lot of econometric work at the time, but I was sure that we had indexation, we had inflation expectations, we had everything. At the end, what mattered was past inflation. Wages were catching up. So the basic risk is that the story I told you before, this is a tax should not be transferred, there should be no races between wages and prices. Well, if it will not repeat, it will down. If it repeats, then something happens. What should happen? Well, will be a very strong reaction on part of monetary policy. For the time being, however, there are good news. For example, the markets have a good mood now. Maybe they're making mistakes, but for the time being, they are somehow considering that the probability of high inflation is going down very sharp. It was very high until mid-2022. There was a good friend, the professor, Ricardo Reis, who is rather important. Sorry, I'm close to my time. Who somehow said, look, it was at the top, up. The probability of inflation going below above 3 or 4% is pretty high. Now it's going down dramatically, and there is no tail risk. But the tightening has to continue because of the risk of catching up. My point here, it has to be gradual. I don't think that we should privilege the risk of doing too much with respect to the risk of doing too little. If we do too much, there will be higher inflation, we have to tighten more, so this is a risk. We have to be more restrictive for a longer period of time. If we do too little, well, we may overshoot on the downside. Rather than 2%, we may go below. Inflation expectations may account for that. Real interest rates may increase. And there are non-linearities from balance sheets of firms. Somebody called the debt deflation risks. This was a risk we had countered in the course before the pandemics. I don't want to come back again. So we have to be prudent. There are in economics various theories. One is a famous proposition by Brainerd, who says that if there is uncertainty, the central bank should be prudent, and there is a lot of uncertainty now. Uncertainty whether energy prices go up or down, continue, the war will end, the global economy will actually recover, and so on. But the main point is that if this uncertainty is related to inflation becoming permanent, then you have to react much more violently. So these are the choices we have. Monetary policy is very difficult. It seems some time ago, there were those who were saying, it's not Mervyn King, previous governor of the central bank, was saying, well, monetary policy is good when it is boring. Unfortunately, this day, it is not boring. It is a very difficult exercise. I'd like to conclude with a few. First of all, in the text, you'll find why I believe that the repeat of 1970s is very unlikely. Central banks are much better equipped. Fiscal authorities understand that they should not push too much. Markets work better, but forecasts have to be taken with care because there is always a major problem there. The conclusions are, well, during the pandemics, we were successful, even if perhaps excess demand was created and therefore too much with the benefit of inside was put in the economy. Well, we were very worried at the time. We were worried that the world would change dramatically and that somehow households will start saving a lot and not buying anymore. And we wanted somehow the economy to start picking up again. I think we're successful, but in certain cases, clearly an excessive demand push, and this created inflation. Secondly, bottlenecks. There were bottlenecks because demand increased too much and the supply was not adjusting. Again, inflation. Labor market again, in the United States especially, very tight, wages up and inflation. And then the energy shock, geopolitical, very difficult for economists, central banks and so on, even for intelligence people, to understand the geopolitics. We did not foresee the war. The war has been tremendous, dramatic for the Ukrainian population, and very hard for the economy at the world level, and in Europe especially. It is too early to say whether wages will be reigning. It is inflation expectations for the time being were anchored, but there is no question that monetary policy has to tighten in a gradual way. The lost purchasing power cannot be recovered with a race between wages and profits or spending too much, overspending on the part of the governments. It has to be recovered through the real economy picking up. And so you have to have supply conditions improved and demand not pushing inflation. Extreme uncertainty is there, so difficult. We have to look at the data and decide on the basis of what we see. The mantra is data dependency, and meeting-by-meeting decisions. Finally, I don't think monetary policy will have to tighten if things go out of control, but I don't think that should be left alone. We have history behind us. There are other policies, fiscal policy. Fiscal has to avoid pushing demand, but certainly making the conditions for having higher potential output and therefore reducing the pressure. And it used to be, many years ago, discussed a lot something called income policies. Well, in a new fashion, probably we have to agree that unions and businesses and governments have to speak and understand that the roots of inflation, if they come from their own behavior, have to be kept at bay. And I will close with a sentence that was written in 1981, something like that, by one of my predecessors. In Italy, there was a major difficulty in the 70s and 80s because of those wage price spirals. It was an exceptional success in the 1990s when the central bank was given independence, when fiscal pressures were substantially reduced and the debt stopped increasing, and when there was a major agreement between unions and businesses not to maintain automatic indexation in the system and look forward rather than backward in the wage bargaining process. And he wrote Central Bank's Autonomy, 1980, reinforcement of budgetary procedures, and the code for collective bargaining are a prerequisite for monetary stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Visco. We are extremely grateful to hear the depth of your experiences at the Banca d'Italia. And a point which I found really interesting during your speech was your discussion and elaboration on the recent volatility in disposable income as well as GDP amidst the current war in Ukraine and the ongoing pandemic. And I think that's a sentiment that is shared by many in the audience, as we do have quite a few questions coming in during the Q&A session, which I'll get right into. I believe we have a question from a journalist. Yes, please.
Thank you, Governor, for your speech. I have a question on behalf of Alessandra Migliacchio from Bloomberg News. She's asking, during your speech, you said the gradual wait-and-see approach is needed on interest rates, but do you have a target? Meaning, how high do you think interest rates will have to rise? The markets, for example, are currently estimating terminal rate for inflation at 3.5%. Does that seem realistic to you?
I did not catch.
Yeah, could we repeat that again? I believe the question was about the terminal rate of inflation being at 3.5%.
Of interest rates, not of inflation.
Interest rates, yeah.
Interest rates.
I thought it was interest rate.
Right.
There is. This is a very important thing. There is an idea in economics that somehow central banks should have in mind what a natural rate is. The natural rate of interest is the one that equates investment and saving, basically. And our interest rate is below that, and this generates inflation. If it is too high, it creates recession. This is the kind of a big sell agreement. I don't believe that this has anything to do with the real world. But this is my own view. It's important to saving, and at the end there is a real interest rates that helps having these equate. But that is the steady state. It's called the natural rate. Can the interest rates today go above that? It should. It's not can. It has to, because all the estimates, they're very precise. But basically, if you take all the investment in the world, saving in the world, the demographic prospects, and so on, you end up having an idea of a real interest rate that's not much different than zero nowadays. Well, taught in the 60s, interest rates, real interest rates should not be very different from the real rate of change of the economy. So if the real rate of change of the economy is 2% and the real rate is 0, you wonder why. Must be, for the time being, what most estimates end up having, and there might be heterogeneity across the world. So maybe 0 in advanced economies, higher in emerging economies, and at the end, the global equation of quality of saving and investment produces an interest rate in real terms, which is similar to the rate of growth of the world. But what is interesting is that the terminal rate is where really we think that in the process of somehow disinflation from high inflation, we can wait because this process goes smoothly. We are now at 3%, say, when we have the March decision, if it is really accomplished, done. And there are questions whether it can go to 325, 350, whatever. Remember one thing. Everybody's how rates were considered in 1980s to stop inflation going up. What was the interest rate prevailing, the official rates? It was 13%, 15%, 18%. In the US, there was the Volcker disinflation, which it created a substantial recession. For the time being, we are not in that world, so we are behaving. Terminal rate, I don't know. The real answer, the true answer is we don't know. But I don't think that it will be the same as in the 1970s and 80s.
What an articulate answer that was. Let us do one question from the in-person audience. The person over there, can we get a mic to him, please?
Good morning, Governor. I'm Alessandro from the University of Naples, and I wanted to ask you, we know that in macroeconomic theory, inflation expectation of households are very important to shape the intertemporal substitution of consumption across time. And a lot of economists stressed during the last decade that forward guidance and credibility of central banks are very important to comply with the mandate of a central bank. So my question is, during this time where there is no zero lower bound framework, is still credibility and forward guidance of central banks are still very important and effective to comply with central bank's mandate? Thank you.
Well, forward guidance was very much useful in a period when there were deflation risks, because we had to tell the market basically that we were going to maintain favorable, easy conditions. And this does not mean that we created a lot of money to push prices up. We created money by purchasing bonds, and the purchase of bonds had an effect on the price of bonds. And the prices of bonds across the curve went down, and the financing opportunities for the economy to recover and generate higher inflation, if you want, but at the 2%, that is what we consider to be stable prices, to take place. And forward guidance helped that. Then when we have a shock, we realized that this could not work. In the summer of 2021, we had a retreat of the ECB, a meeting of the governors in a particular place. And we discussed how to change our strategy. We made two changes. The first was we decided that our objective was symmetric. So we want to have 2% both when we are above that or when we are below that. And the second is that since we were below that, and Keynes would have said we were in a liquidity trap. Big style way, it is the lower bound. It was not zero, it was effective, too low interest rates. We were using forward guidance to get out of the trap and go back to 2%. Then the shock takes place. Inflation expectations stop going down, they go back. They are anchored now at 2%. There is no need to tell much them where should they be, because we want them to 2%. They know that, everybody understands it. It is a speed that is relevant. But what is crucial for forward guidance is is really to tell the market what is our view of inflation expectations, where it should be. The market knows it. It is not anymore a part of the story. What the part of the story is our reaction to the data that we observe. And so it is, while forward, it is the data that will come. Now it is, since there is high uncertainty, we still have to understand really with sufficient confidence where inflation sources will direct. We have to decide meeting by meeting, we say, or as we have done in the last couple of meetings, every other meeting.
Right. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. And Governor, I think we'll take our last question from our Slido platform. We have the question right here. We've received it. It's on the role of central banks. Do you call for more independence of national central banks in order to be able to react more flexibly to fiscal policies and inflation developments?
It is a tough thing because there was a theory which was very interesting in the 1980s, which has to do with time consistency and the game between fiscal authorities and central banks. Basically, if the fiscal authorities generate inflation, the central bank is there exactly to avoid, and being independent has given the power to avoid that, restricting policy and raising interest rates against the quote-unquote mistakes of governments. There is something on this story. At the end, the, I would say, horizon of politics is short. So you have elections, you have to win the elections, you promise cutting taxes, maybe you get major problems like in this country a few months ago, but really it is much shorter than our horizon. Our horizon is longer. So in this sense, there is this game going on. I think that, however, when there is this kind of risk, the one that we are seeing now, dialogue is fundamental. We have to dialogue with fiscal authorities. We have to dialogue with the social partners. It is a joint endeavor. We cannot act only as central bankers, because if we are acting as central bankers, in order to obtain our objective against all the rest, we have to generate a recession. And I think we can avoid generating a recession if we somehow have what was called at times cooperation. I think dialogue is a better word these days.
Indeed, indeed. And with our last answer, I would like to thank our audience and both Governor Visco as well for your articulate answers, sir. I think this has been a tremendous session, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So thank you, Governor.